few minutes, but for those trickling in, this is not for the Water Policy Council. This is just for everybody attending. So feel free to sit at the table. Thanks. All right, good morning, folks. Thanks for coming. And welcome to the first technical working group meeting. Just so everybody knows, this is going to be an informal conversation. We do have slides to facilitate what we've got to present for you, but that should not be understood to be to be adding formality to this. If folks have questions or comments or something to say, we're here to hear it. I'll note that to do that effectively, you're going to want a mic, not just for the benefit of everyone here in the room, but online. They're not going to hear you if you're not using a mic. So anyone's free to sit anywhere they're comfortable. But if you want to say something, here at the table is probably where it's going to be best to do that. We can start, since this group is small enough, just running around and doing introductions. I know most of you are going to know most of you, but for the benefit of anyone who doesn't, we'll walk through, do introductions here in the room. We'll kick it over to do introductions online. And Nick, for those online, if you want to go ahead and do an introduction, just go ahead and raise your hand and we'll unmute you and tell you when it's your turn to talk. But if it's all right, we can start here at the far end of the table with Carol and just start introductions there.
Certainly. Good morning, everyone. I'm Carol Ward. I'm the Assistant Director for Planning and Permitting here at DWR.
Rob Anderson with Fenimore here for Home Builders Association.
My name is Ben Bryce with DWR. I'm a special advisor to Director Bushatsky.
My name's Natalie Mast. I think I know most everybody in here. I am the Active Management Areas Director here at ADWR.
Good morning, Emily Petrick. I'm Deputy Counsel for ADWR.
Morning, Jake Lender King, Global Water Resources.
Terry Sue Rossi, Arizona Water Company.
Mike Caparoso. I am representing BKW Farms in Marana, down in that other AMA down south.
Mike Milano with Greenstone.
Irrigation and Drainage District.
Good morning, I'm Dave Roberts, and I'm here on behalf of the Buckeye Water Conservation and Drainage District and the Roosevelt Irrigation District.
Annelies Regelbrugge, I'm with Environmental Defense Fund.
Simone Williams, I'm with AMOR.
Scott Riggins, Production Agriculture and Investment Real Estate in the Pinell AMA.
All right, and we can kick it over real quick to those online, and then if there's anyone in the audience who wants to opine, I guess we can probably get one of these mics out to you. Just a second.
All right, we're going to move on to Krista. Krista, you're now unmuted. If you can introduce yourself.
River Project.
That's all the attendees online by hand raised. One more, we've got Stefan Stefan, I have you on mute now. Go ahead and introduce yourself.
I'm Stephen Wilson. I'm representing the town of Gilbert. I'm the Water and Energy Resources Planning Advisor. Thank you for hosting this event.
And we've got Nicole Sonnenberg. Nicole, could you unmute?
Hi, this is Nicole Sonnenberg, the Water Resources Manager for the town of Queen Creek.
We've got Laura. Laura, you are unmuted now. Could you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yano, a manager of the Central Arizona Groundwater Replenishment District.
Joe Singleton, you're now unmuted. Could you introduce yourself?
Hey, Joe Singleton, Executive Director, Canal County Water Augmentation Authority.
And Peter Mock, your hand is still raised. Are you able to unmute?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
I'm Peter Mock. I'm a hydrologist consulting to the Gila River Indian community.
Thank you. That's everyone online.
Thanks, Garrett. And now to the folks in the audience.
Terry Lowe, City of Buckeye.
Bobby Anastaso with the City of Buckeye.
Fred Schneider, Arizona Water Company.
Nick Vanderway, West Valley farmer and land investor.
Mike Vanderway.
Cool. All right. Thanks, everybody. Wonderful to have you all today. Just as a recap, nothing that any of you don't already know, but this is the first meeting of the technical working group for ADWR's informal stakeholder process. This is the second of the meetings that have been held as part of that effort. The first one was held earlier this month. As I'm sure most of you know, that was a productive meeting. We had a lot of things that we touched on. And just as a quick recap, we focused most of our efforts on land eligibility and the conversion rate, and we heard a lot of things. Some of them were pretty easy to deal with, questions about whether GSFs would count as irrigation, things like that. And then we heard some other questions and concerns about whether the Tucson AMA should be included, the way that we would factor large IGFRs that wouldn't all have been put to irrigation, things like that. We're continuing to work on those. But something that we did continually hear was that the dashboard is very helpful to folks, which we're very pleased with, but that we need to dig into the assumptions and the numbers that make up the dashboard. So that's what we're here to do today. But before we continue, I will just put a point on the fact that one of the things that we have heard more than once is that as we proceed, that we need to be thoughtful about the replenishment obligation that would be placed on the Central Arizona Groundwater Replenishment District as part of this effort. Now, we don't speak for CAGRD, but we have continued to hear that that is something we need to be thoughtful about. And so I just note that as we continue to look at the dashboard, as we continue to look at our assumptions, that the replenishment obligation put on the GRD is not something that is factored into the dashboard, that the dashboard is really looking at groundwater use and replenishment. Assuming that replenishment happens, it does not account for what that would do to GRD. So I just note that. You hit the next slide. Thanks. Meeting logistics, we covered most of this already. I'll just say that if you do run into issues, you can contact our help desk at 602-771-844, or you can email tickets at azwater.gov and we'll get you sorted. Hit the next one. Thanks, Natalie. And then our agenda. So today we're going to talk a little bit about data in the dashboard and assumptions. We're going to talk a little bit more about the role of replenishment, and then we'll turn to the dashboard assumptions and discussion where I will stop talking and let Natalie, who actually knows, talk about what goes into the dashboard, and then we'll talk about next steps in the process. You could probably just hit twice. I need to sit on these intro slides. Okay, so data in the dashboard and assumptions. Just as a recap, just to note, we said this last meeting, but we're really trying to be led by the principles that were set out by the Governor's Water Policy Council Assured Water Supply Committee, which is specifically to address challenges that are revealed by the Assured Water Supply modeling while continuing to strengthen the integrity of the Assured Water Supply program, protect consumers, and ensure that future growth is not reliant on mined groundwater. So for purposes of this group, what we'd like to emphasize is that when we're talking about improvements to the dashboard, when we're talking about changes, we really feel that that needs to be led by good data. And we also, lifelong Arizonan, my family's been here forever. I hope to see that things continue and get better over time. But the reality is that we're facing a pretty stark reality right now. So while we're going to hope for the best, we need to prepare for hard realities. And so we want that in mind as we talk about the dashboard, that changes to the dashboard, improvements to the dashboard need to be data led, and it needs to be data that acknowledges the fact that optimism aside, and we're hoping to see the best outcomes, that we have to prepare for the worst. Is there anything I should say there? Perfect. All right. So one more thing on replenishment. There has been a lot of, I think, miscommunication at times about the role that replenishment is going to play in the dashboard, in an ag to urban program. And so I want to be very clear about what the department is saying and what the department means when we talk about replenishment and when you see replenishment on the dashboard. For anyone who has looked at the dashboard recently, you'll notice a new replenishment rate has been added. That's a 50% rate. That's not a signal from DWR. That was in response to a request from Senate majority staff, and we were happy to make that change for them, a specific request from them. But that does not indicate that we're changing how we're thinking about replenishment, but happy to be helpful there. When we talk about replenishment, we are not talking about a new lever to be pulling in an ag to urban program. We've talked about what the proper conversion rate should be, right? As something that can be changed in the program. And as conversations continue, we hope to coalesce around where the proper conversion rate is going to be. But we are not here at the department talking about changing how replenishment is calculated. All of you know better than me that to get to your replenishment rate, you have to calculate through rules that are already set how to be consistent with the management goal. We do not see that changing. So when we have on the dashboard different replenishment rates, that represents a range as we try and plan for possibilities that we may face. It does not, for us, represent new levers to pull. I acknowledge that that's not necessarily the way that everyone is thinking about an ag to urban program, and fair enough. But when we're talking about it, that's how we're thinking about it. And so I want to be clear that as folks are using the dashboard and playing with the replenishment rates, happy that you're doing it, but it doesn't represent levers that we're expecting to change as part of an ag to urban program.
The one thing that I would add there is right now on the dashboard, we have a range from 0 to 100%, which is a very broad range of potential replenishment for an ag to urban program. As we work through this technical group process, as we work through this stakeholder process, our hope is that additional analysis will help us narrow that range and better understand what our more realistic range of reality would be under a program like this. We're not prepared to really get into the weeds of that today, but we will make sure to continue having discussions about that as we go through this process.
Excellent. Thanks, Sally. Can you hit the next one for me? Yeah, go ahead.
while we're on the topic, and I don't know where we're going to go from there, in discussing replenishment, is there already a realization that not all areas within all MAs are the same? So this isn't a broad brush that paints everything. There'll have to be realizations of differentials, will there not?
So as a part of the additional analysis that we're doing to better understand potential replenishment, we are looking at location-specific factors. That said, at the end of the day, a program that would be successful would need to recognize or would need to reflect water savings at the AMA scale. So while there are localized differences, we do also have to look at that broad scale picture.
And I concur. I've never, even in older systems that no longer exist, I never saw anything where there were direct conversions over. There was always conservation factors and lessenings when IGFRs were converted. That's always been that way. However, there are within the different AMAs and within each AMA, there are different circumstances. And for this to be successful, I don't see how everything can be painted the same. There's going to be some differentials. I don't believe I don't think this is an IGFR by IGFR differential I'm discussing. It's more of an area differential. For instance, the Pinell AMA and the Buckeye area certainly have differentials. And so how they could be done exactly the same is difficult to imagine.
Sure. And we are certainly looking at different specifics to the program between AMAs. So for example, the conversion rates and our replenishment assumptions will definitely be different across AMAs.
And I hope that also has some thoughts on differences within the individual AMAs as well. I don't think that areas that have a profusion of realistic groundwater and areas that have virtually nothing underneath them at all, particularly when it gets to replenishment, can be considered in exactly the same fashion.
It sounds like your hope is that the way that replenishment is calculated would change. Is that unfair?
It would change from what?
From what it currently is?
That's a large question. I don't see how with this coming into play and the discussions with it, it's hard to see how it can remain exactly the same.
I see. Okay.
Exactly how those changes are, I don't think we've got there yet.
Understood. Okay, thank you.
I have a question.
Yeah.
What is the current requirement?
Oh, as set in rule, you want me to walk you through it?
No.
Okay.
So
Isn't it, well, Natalie and I have talked about this, isn't it 100% or 96% or whatever the number is?
So when we're referring to the current replenishment requirements, what we're referring to is consistency with the management goal.
Right.
Mhm.
Consistency with the management goal can be met by replenishment, or it can be met through groundwater allowances and extinguishment credits.
Right.
And so replenishment, an 100% replenishment assumption is not necessarily valid because there are things that are going to reduce that replenishment obligation from 100%.
That's right.
And I think the director did, going back to Scott's opening comments about different locations, and he brought up the Buckeye area. Certainly, I think the director made some comments at the last meeting indicating that maybe we need to look at the Buckeye waterlogged area a little bit differently. And so,
He did say that. Your memory serves. Yeah.
so
At least I remember it that way.
I'm expecting at some point that we'll have a discussion about that. So, okay.
That's right. He did commit to looking into the issue. Certainly. Go ahead. Yeah.
I think maybe, and Scott, maybe I'm off on this, but it sounds like maybe your concern is more with meeting the requirement of physically available groundwater, where you're saying certain areas that would, I don't think this is going to change the rules there, where you actually have to show that the groundwater is underneath you to move forward, which is one key component. Another key component is, staying in consistent management goal and doing those things. So I think that might be where your difference is. So areas that have no groundwater underneath them, let's say up against a mountain range, still wouldn't qualify without some other work, correct?
And I
Okay.
think that's a good clarification. There's a lot of pieces to this. And it's hard to keep them all straight sometimes. Hopefully my mic's on. So when we're talking about making sure there's actually water under where a given development would be, that's part of the consumer protection check that would also be built into this policy. But that check is not necessarily built into the dashboard in the same way as conversion rates and other things that we would be focusing on as a part of the data analysis. Yeah, it's a good point.
And just to clarify, one of the very important interplays will be the concept of replenishment, how it plays against the concept of extinguishment. They are things that don't exist separately. They exist in the same sphere. And so it needs to be considered how they will play with each other when they deal with that. When you are extinguishing rights and creating conservation on a groundwater basin, you certainly don't have the same situations where you have no rights to hardly extinguish. Well, we're talking ag to urban, so there's always rights to extinguish. But it also depends on what the allocations are and where physical availability is pegged within various AMAs. There's different ways those AMAs work. And also you have an interplay with surface water that comes into that as well. So it's complicated. And so it's hard to just have a beginning discussion that just talks about replenishment. It is a problem for sure. There are areas that there will be difficulties, but all these things have to be woven together into the same tapestry.
Fair. And it's a good point to make how all of these things definitely are interconnected to each other. What we're really going to try to focus on today is some of the specifics of the analysis. And as we go back to our larger group meetings, we've got one next week. As we continue to have discussions about the different guardrails and components of this policy, we will definitely be talking more about how those different pieces fit together and interact with one another. That's a good point.
Yeah, just for clarity. Excuse me, folks. For clarity. Yeah, well, they can take it out of my paycheck. For clarity, I bring up replenishment not because we're prepared to really dig into the weeds of it, but I do feel I do feel that there is probably different understandings of how replenishment is going to come into play. And so I want to make sure that we're being super clear with folks about what the department means. My understanding is that there's different ways that they're thinking about it in the among some folks over in the legislature right now. Oh, I'm sorry. Have you been waiting on us, Rob? Go ahead. Oh, well, I'm here to hear from you folks. You know, just for that. But it's not working. So I just hope to add some clarity to how we're talking about it, and that way hopefully avoid some of the miscommunication that I think happened, especially last session. There was a lot of folks who wondered what does 100% replenishment mean? Are we talking about 100% of the water you withdraw, 100% of your excess groundwater? Are we adding a new replenishment obligation? Are we not? So I want to be clear. This is what we mean. When you use the dashboard, that's how we're thinking about it. We're going to need to get into the details, of course. Not today, but that's the reason that I make that note. But go ahead.
Just wanted to make see if I can do this without breaking this mic. I just want to make a policy point. I think there's been a lot of interesting points made about replenishment here, and obviously there is a concern about GRD being able to meet replenishment obligations, and I don't want to mean to downplay that. But I also don't think we should be dismissing or downplaying replenishment in an ag to urban program. If you boil this down to its essentials, we're displacing a higher water use, an important water use. I don't mean to downplay ag water use, but we're displacing a higher water use that has traditionally not been able to had the tax base to address water quality issue, water importation issues. They haven't been able to pay for CAP supplies, for example, unless they've been heavily subsidized. We're replacing that water use with a water use that's significantly less and that brings in a tax base that can pay for solving water problems in the future. And that includes carrying with it a replenishment obligation. So if we're going to say, well, we're not going to consider replenishment, we're really missing a major point there, which is from a policy standpoint, we're substituting one use that isn't able to import and solve water problems because of the lack of financial resources with one that can. So.
Just to clarify, our intent there was not to dismiss replenishment by any means. It's certainly an important component here and is something that is a really important part of consistency with the management goal as a part of our assured water supply program. Our intent there was really saying we're not in ADWR's perspective, we are not looking at changing consistency with the management goal. So for the purposes of this analysis, we really see replenishment as more of an assumption that is built into the analysis rather than a lever to be pushed one way or another.
And thanks for pointing out that ag's important, because I would be disinvited to Thanksgiving back home if it got out that I didn't think that. So anything else on replenishment before? Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, this is Emily Petrick. I just wanted to add how I was thinking about this for the dashboard assumptions is that the assumptions in the dashboard for replenishment is what we're assuming that is actually going to be replenished under existing consistency with management goal requirements. So that's why the various numbers are put there, is we're trying to figure out what's actually going to be replenished under the existing requirements. And so right now there's a bunch of different numbers there, and we're trying to land on the number that we think will reflect what's actually going to be replenished under existing requirements.
I have a question there. Oh, go ahead.
Go first.
Here you go. Ladies always first.
So if I understand correctly, these are really more not guesses necessarily, but a concept of at the aggregate level, what the existing methods for groundwater allowances and extinguishment credits will result at the AMA level. Okay. All right.
For those online, yes, right. We're thinking, yeah, we're not accounting for every individual portfolio. We're just trying to anticipate AMA wide what we would expect. That's right. Go ahead, Dave.
And since you're looking at this over 100-year period, what the savings would be if we had this program versus not, I think allowances and extinguishment credits have a life. I mean, people want to use them, they're gone. And once they're gone, then it's the only other option you have is replenishment. And so I think when we're doing the assumptions and looking at this over 100 years, you need to factor in when those things are going to be gone. I mean, so, and I don't know that that's in your dashboard right now or not, but certainly I'd take that into account. So.
Thanks, Dave. It's definitely something we're considering. We've got some refinement to do there. Yeah, we have some refinement to do there. Maybe I'll leave it at that.
This is Mike Milano. I think I'll add to Dave. I think the other thing to keep in mind as you refine that dashboard is that ECs can no longer be created in the Phoenix AMA, and in the Pinal AMA, they have serious limitations to how they can be used and they diminish. So I would say you should probably look more forward than backwards on that number when you do it. So probably move that replenishment rate up, because you're not going to have those options. You're not going to be able to retire this piece of farmland, especially in the Phoenix AMA, and get that. And in the Pinal AMA, you're going to get amount of credits, but they're going to go down at that year 20, no matter how many you have left, essentially go away. So anyway, that's.
All right, for the non-substantive portion of today's meeting, this was a really great conversation. I'll turn it over to Natalie to get into the weeds.
Before,
Oh, go ahead.
sorry,
Garrett.
apologies. We have an attendee online who had a hand raised.
Garrett informs me that we've got folks online that I neglected to call on.
Laura, I saw you put your hand back down. I'm gonna go ahead and unmute you here if I can. Let's see. I think you're unmuted, Laura.
Oh, there you go. Thank you. I just wanted to echo the last two speakers. I think that really hit the nail on the head with just replenishment that, we can, I think the dashboard replenishment as being described by the department was put there to just look at some general planning assumptions on what the general replenishment rates might be, given the other ways or methods to meet consistency with management goal. But because we really, and I think we'll talk more about this potentially in future meetings, there really hasn't been any discussion about any type of groundwater allowances generated through these physical availability credits or conversion. And so eventually those would be coming to potentially the GRD once those groundwater allowances and extinguishment credits are exhausted. So I think that's a consideration that GRD is looking at long term at least. So just wanted to add that and echo those 2 points made. Thanks.
Thank you. Anyone else online, Garrett?
None right now, but if you do have a comment, please raise your hand and I'll try to introduce you.
I have one more thing to add to that, sorry. The other side of the coin here is that there's going to be effluent generated by these new lands. And so that is another supply that could offset the GRD replenishment obligation. So that factors in as a positive side relative to what might happen, so.
Got it. Thank you.
And if I may follow up on Mr. Roberts' statement, with desert landscaping, the amount of water for replenishment once things go and develop is very much higher than the amount of replenishment when they're in agriculture. So there is a double benefit actually in conversion. The actual use contributes a lot more water back into the aquifer. So again, trying to calculate all these aspects, but from a agricultural point of view and IGFRs, when one agrees that one is going to convert to some sort of an extinguishment credit, the incredible conservation happens right at that point. All of a sudden, there's a whole lot less demand on an AMA because those rights have been minimized to whatever percentage gets put on that.
Just a point of clarification, and thank you, Scott, for that comment. We've been cautious not to call these extinguishment credits just to avoid confusion. Extinguishment credits were allowed to be created to help meet consistency with the management goal. Those can no longer be created as of the beginning of the year. And so we've been using a lot of different terms for this physical availability relinquishment, Ben is telling me, physical availability, concept. But I just wanted to clarify that just to avoid any confusion.
And I fully recognize that. I was very much involved in that process that changed the Pinal AMA of the concept of extinguishment credits. However, the term is very useful to understand how things operated and where exactly some of the impediments were. And the changes that were brought to the Pinal AMA actually, had other directions been considered, the Pinal AMA would not be in the situation it is in right now. The elimination of extinguishment credits did not solve the problem that could have been solved at the time. And I'm certainly not going to get into all those things at this point in time. However, I do believe the term extinguishment credits, even though it's not going to be a term of art going forward in regulation or statute, I do believe it's still a valid thing to use to bring back up certain ways that things were done in the past to be able to see some equivalencies.
Sure. These are definitely parallel. We've just been trying to avoid any confusion that might be created by the
I
commentary.
wasn't trying to use a bad word.
But your historical understanding is very appreciated. Thanks, sir. And you noted how different uses have different replenishment rates. I think we get into that in our slides. Yeah, so let's do that.
All right. So I really do appreciate all of the discussions so far. I know in some ways it's, not exactly what we planned for this presentation, but in some ways that's exactly what this technical group is for, is to really get into the weeds of all of this. So thank you for all of that. And I hope you'll continue chiming in and voicing your thoughts and opinions and suggestions as we get into some more of the weeds through this presentation. So we do have a handful of assumptions that are specifically built into the dashboard that we wanted to cover today. The assumptions that we are really focusing on are those that are built into the dashboard. We've also looked at a number of other things, and I'll talk through that as we go through each individual one of these. But I just want to say that we are really trying to evaluate a range of scenarios through this analysis. And what's reflected on the dashboard is really just a sample of that for simplicity and understandability. So, first item, development patterns and population growth. This one is fairly straightforward in terms of the data. For population growth, ADWR is actually subject to an old executive order that requires state agencies to use the state demographer's population projections. So we used the state demographer's population projections for this. We did use, the state demographer produces low, mid, and high range projections. We, for the dashboard purposes, used the medium series as the most likely scenario, but we have also looked at those high and low series just for our own information to see how that influences things. That population projection data is available online. There's a link on here. We will be posting these slides on our website for folks to be able to access that raw data if that's helpful. For housing, in terms of trying to understand this program, what we really needed to understand was, okay, if an acre of agriculture retires, what does that mean in terms of housing? So we had to look at those rates of population growth from the state demographer and use those to translate to housing acres. And so what we were able to find was some data indicating current rates of housing unit development and current rates, current density information in both the Phoenix and Pinal AMAs. So I know this is sort of small. Again, we'll post this on the website. And this information is also on the kind of cover page for the dashboard. But Phoenix AMA started at 35,000 housing units per year being built and a density of 3.9 units per acre. Pinal was at 6.9 thousand housing units per year and at 3.1 units per acre. With the population projections, we assume that houses being built will increase as population increases, because those folks theoretically would need a place to live. So, so we matched the rate of change for housing units increasing over time to the rate of population growth. Go ahead, please.
So Natalie, sorry, this is where I really start to, my ability to understand this starts to really fade. What we're seeing in the housing markets is that the inability to get certificates of sure water supply is affecting the affecting the housing stock. It usually takes something like 3 to 5 years to go from a farm to a house. And so the moratorium that's been on certificates has been only in place for a little over a year and a half. In Pinal, it's been longer than that, but there was a lot of existing certificates that people have been building on. So I'm wondering, I'm wondering how do we capture that in this housing growth projection? Because we really are getting to a point where people are looking at farmland I've seen this in the Phoenix AMA multiple times, and it's like, you can't, under the current program, flat that property. So that's going to reduce the available housing. How are we going to capture that?
That's a fair question, Rob, and I appreciate it. The way I'm thinking about this, and I'm certainly open to feedback, this is why we're here, and open to if there's additional data that's available somewhere out there that we might not necessarily know about, I would certainly be open to looking at additional data regarding housing trends and that type of thing.
Well, I think you might be able to capture that by looking at, well, actually asking some of the water providers here about what they're seeing in terms of new customers, but looking at certificate dependent areas and seeing if you're seeing any trends in terms of new housing units, building permits within those jurisdictions. So that'd be Buckeye, that'd be Queen Creek, that would be areas served by Arizona Water Company, EPCOR, undesignated. I don't know. Okay. It's just an idea. I don't.
Fair enough. I'll think about that a little bit. I might reach out to you or some others with questions as I think through that. The way I'm thinking about it kind of big picture though, is that if we're considering a scenario where this program exists and folks are able to develop on agricultural lands, then yeah, there might be some noise in kind of those early years, but when we're looking at a 100-year projection, the housing stock would probably balance out in the kind of long term in terms of catching up, if you will. And let me know if that didn't make sense or if I need to explain that further.
Continuing on that conversation,
I'm speaking to your microphone.
Right. To continue that discussion, I wonder if any consideration is being given to kind of, when you look at a shorter term horizons, the match between the conversion and the savings from the conversion, whether that is meeting the objectives of the program in terms of benefits to the aquifer. And given that there is going to be a lag between the move from agricultural land use to urban land use, is anything being built into the analysis to capture that? The second part of my question relates to the impact it may have on, for instance, differences in incidental recharge from the two land uses, and trying to capture that so that whatever is projected as savings is realized during implementation.
I will get to the incidental recharge piece. Sorry, microphone. I will get to the incidental recharge piece on a later slide. Yes, for that piece. Regarding the lag, I think that's something that we'll definitely look into a little bit more here. Yeah, I think we'll have a little bit more work to do there, and we can discuss that a little bit more at a future meeting. Okay, oh, sorry, Terry Sue, let me go to the person online and then we'll come back to you.
Hi, this is Krista McJunkin. I just want to kind of continue on Rob's question. So the state demographers' projections don't take into account the fact that you can't get new certificates of assured water supply. So I don't know that that's the right data source to start with for your status quo projections. And I think it might be helpful to think about it instead of on an AMA-wide basis, think about a particular IGFR. And an IGFR that does not have a certificate of assured water supply and is not served by a designated provider can't convert to houses now. And so it's going to stay in agricultural production. And there's really no two ways about it. In my opinion, I'm sure the farmers in the room can speak to this, but you don't typically take land out of production. It has to produce some type of income for you. So I think when we start from that point, I'm having trouble reconciling what it looks like on a specific IGFR standpoint and comparing that to these overall AMA projections of a significant decline in ag land. So that's where I'm coming from.
So maybe we can come back to that because I think that touches on some of the additional assumptions that we have in future slides here. And I don't want to get ahead of this particular slide too much, but I understand where you're coming from, Krista, and I think it's a discussion that we can definitely have.
Okay, thanks.
My question is these two items are on this particular slide. Is that because you use the population growth data to determine the housing acreage conversion, or is there no relationship there?
So the rate of population growth was used to increase the number of housing units being built over time to address those new
Okay.
that new population.
So you took that population growth, I just need to understand the math on it. Took that population growth, you divided it by some number in order to figure out how many housing units we're talking about.
Functionally, yes.
Right. And then you spread those across time, 35,000 units a year in Phoenix and 6,900 a year in Pinal. Am I right so far?
For the starting point, and then those numbers increased according to population growth, changes in the percentage of population growth. So as your rate of population growth increases or changes over time, we indexed that number of housing units to population changes.
Okay. So it started at those numbers, and then you said this is the ratio of those units in the year one. And you then, as the population grew, you applied that same percentage and said that's the new growth. Is that right? Okay. So those population growth numbers cover, the counties, right? And don't cover an AMA exactly, right? And how did you figure out how to disaggregate at the county area between the AMAs? And then how did you decide how to disaggregate the data by who would be building on farmland versus desert?
So for these purposes, it's a really good question, and I appreciate it, Terry Sue. For these purposes, excuse me, we treated, because these projections are created at the county level, you're absolutely correct. We really just treated the growth rate in Maricopa County as Phoenix AMA, Pinal County as Pinal AMA. It's imperfect, but it
just
was
asking
kind of
how-
the closest that we could get.
Yeah, I'm not asking for perfection, just asking how you did it. So now at least I get that. I
Yeah.
would have done the same thing. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So
Not questioning it, just wondering how.
a suggestion rather than a question. Would ADWR consider in looking at sensitivity analysis to the estimates that you're doing? What if population growth is not even? So what if there's a spike in the short term that would impact how the savings or the conversion within a short period versus an even conversion over time? So I'd suggest that be one of the sensitivity analysis that is examined as part of the larger analysis.
We've conducted some sensitivity analysis on some of the components here. We haven't done every single item. I don't think we've done that specific one, but we can look into checking that. Thank you.
And I'm sorry, we didn't get to the part where you explain to me with the assumptions you made about what went on ag land versus non in terms of those new housing units.
Right. So this is actually something that I hope to add to the dashboard at some point. We haven't had an opportunity to do this yet. Right now, the assumption built into the dashboard is that all development is happening on agricultural lands. We understand that that's a really aggressive assumption, that other development would happen elsewhere. And so what I hope to do as an improvement to the dashboard is add another filter on the dashboard that allows you to go 0%, 25%, 100%, similar to the other filters on there.
Hi, this is Mike Caparoso. I can't think that type 1 retirement and ag extinguishment that has happened, mostly IGFR retirement, not necessarily type 1 rights, but where ag has been retired to type 1 for various purposes at a fairly significant water use per acre allocation. I trying to figure out how that might tie into this.
Have a slide on that. Let me.
Oh, okay. I'm ahead of myself. Why? Okay, thanks.
Great question. Okay. All right, well, let's go ahead and move ahead. I think we're scheduled, we've got another hour, so we're all right on time. Okay. We touched on this a little bit, I think, with Krista's questions. So I did, again, I apologize for deferring some of the questions, but some of this is on slides here. Agricultural water use. For the purposes of the dashboard, what we looked at is total eligible acres based on their water use. So eligible meaning that they used water in 3 out of the last 5 reporting years, and that they didn't have an existing certificate overlying those lands. We are still refining some of those eligible acres numbers. So you'll probably, in the next couple of weeks or so, see an update to those initial acreage numbers. But that's kind of the approach that we're taking there. So we looked at total eligible acres in the 2 AMAs, and we looked at the current water usage, specifically the current groundwater usage associated with those acres. So obviously something like incidental recharge, which I'll get to on a later slide, is based on total water use. But for the purposes of the program, when we're thinking about conversion rates, we really need to focus on that groundwater portion of the water use on those agricultural acres. So that's what the dashboard takes into account. Did you have anything to add there? Fair enough. You're all right. Thank you. For ag attrition, and I know this is something that folks have had a lot of questions about. Generally, what we did was we looked at rates of water use across the AMAs over time. And as a general trend, we have seen agricultural acres decline and agricultural water use decline over our historical period from, we kind of refer to our data from 1985 on, just because those initial AMAs took a little time to establish and actually get good reported data in. So we usually look at 1985 on for that historical data. What is actually reflected in the dashboard? For Phoenix, we used a 1.3% annual rate of decline for agriculture in the Phoenix AMA. And that reflects retirements for all sorts of reasons, whether that land goes vacant or whether it's an industrial use or whether it's development for housing. Yeah, so that was based on that historic use. In Pinal, we took a little bit of a different approach. In Pinal, if we look at the historic use, that actually comes out to a 3.7% rate. And you'll see on the screen that the dashboard actually uses a 2% rate. What we're kind of acknowledging and recognizing there is that there's been a lot of changes in Pinal recently in terms of water availability and how water is used in that AMA. And so instead of using that higher 3.7% rate for the purpose of the dashboard, we matched this rate to the rate of agricultural decline that is used in the Pinal Assured Water Supply model. So that's where that -2% comes from for Pinal. The 3.7% rate, we have also been analyzing that in some of our internal analysis. So we are, again, with some of the sensitivity analysis and everything, making sure that we have a broader understanding, but we're also trying to not overload the dashboard with way too much information. So let's see. Maybe before I, sorry, we'll go ahead and take questions. The last slide does cover industrial use and incidental recharge, just to prepare folks, and we'll get to those topics then. So go ahead.
You talk about the decline of water use in Pinal County. How do you distinguish between when they had Central Arizona and recharge and they were just on the pumps? And when you define water use, how do you define it?
So we are looking at groundwater use, one. The other thing is,
Question then.
well, the other thing is that's part of why we ended up using the Pinal model rate for the dashboard, is because we understand that as that Colorado River water availability has declined, gone away in the Pinal AMA, it's taking folks some times to build up their infrastructure for pumping. And so there's potentially going to be some additional rebound there in terms of the amount of groundwater used. And so we, in terms of kind of understanding where we are in history and those potential rates, we chose to use that less extreme decline rate for the purposes of the dashboard, kind of acknowledging that history there. I'm seeing Dan with his hand raised in the back. Dan, you can come sit at the table too. Come on, Dan,
If I heard on the water use part of this slide, you'd said that you were looking at the reporting, the last 3 of the 5 reporting years. So does that, when you look at current rates of groundwater use on those acres, you're looking at the last 5 years or 3 of the last 5 years? And so it's really just pointing out, it's not just an infrastructure issue, especially in Pinal County, as far as a potential rebound. And if you're looking at the current rates of groundwater use in the last couple of years, it also happens to be sort of a down market for agricultural users. So it's almost like if you look at the first management period, and it looks like there wasn't a water availability issue for reason is why there was low water use. It was just hard to sell crops. And so it's really hard to project what that market's going to do, but we know that these ag markets ebb and flow. And the big irrigation districts in Pinal County today have capacity to deliver a lot more groundwater than they have been in the last couple reporting periods. And that's not because they just don't have the users for it, because they're kind of, rotating acres to keep them eligible for crop insurance purposes, but they are going to lose money if they're growing crops on a lot of this land. But if that changes, that can change very quickly, then that might rebound, next year. So that's I don't know how you account for that necessarily. I don't have a firm number to give you, but I think it's fair to say that that's not, that could change really fast. They already can use more water than they're using right now. They're just not, because it would be uneconomic to do it for this year. I don't know if we're going to get into this stuff later, but just on the attrition part, we talked about what's happening to this land. I don't think it's realistic to say that much of this land is going to be idle permanently. Also, just pointing out that a lot of these other alternative uses that are coming in, you look at things that use little water like solar, they're not really 100-year alternative use of land. And I'm not involved in all of these solar projects, but in a lot of them that I've seen, they're not retiring their groundwater rights. And I think that that's intentional because people don't know what's going to happen when you get past the life of these facilities. So they're keeping open the possibility that they're going to go back to using water. And it's probably not a huge lift to be able to farm some of those acres again in the future if that's what happens with it once it's decommissioned.
Thanks, Dan. I'll probably have questions for you at some point. Appreciate it.
Mike Milano, I'm glad Dan just went because I think I want to follow on to his points. I think when you look at the ag land, especially in Pinal, you really want to put that layer on. Is it in a DAS or does it have a cause? Because I would say if you take a look back, you won't really see any of this land permanently coming out. Might be temporary. And I understand I farm 3,000 acres in Pinal, farm a lot in Yuma. When it becomes uneconomic, you can't make that CapEx investment, but you're going to reserve that right. So we have farms in Yuma that are right outside, the district is around it, and we have a pump in the middle of it. Hay prices are bad. We don't put that pump back in just because of economics. Now we're ready. I mean, we're not taking out the ditches when it's ready and you can sell Sudan at the right price. It'll go back in, you'll do it. And so I think you're seeing exactly what he said, a temporary decline that will probably actually go up because of the amount of wells put in and those things happening. So, you know, if we were 10 years from now, I think you would see that. And so I think that's a layer to really look at is there any proof of that without a cause or without a DAS of land really moving out, and maybe some solar projects, things like that. But those again are only temporary, maybe longer term temporary, but still temporary when you're looking at 100 years.
We'll definitely continue to look for additional data sources there. I think to Ben's point at the very beginning of the meeting, part of our rationale for kind of straightlining some of these historical trends is, yes, it's possible that they could go up. Yes, it's also possible that they could continue following some of these historical trends. And in order to make sure that we are being conservative and kind of planning for the worst case scenario, we've used these decline rates for the dashboard purposes. Does that mean they're perfect? Absolutely not. But that was kind of our rationale in how we approached this. There's certainly additional work we can do here. We can certainly refine those and look for additional data sources that can help us better understand those things and whether we might want to adjust those numbers for the analysis.
Hi, Nick Vanderway, Buckeye farmer. So I kind of want to tag on with, the Pinal farmers, but then really to emphasize what Krista said online, that in Buckeye, there is no fallow farm ground. There's just none because the water is available and it's relatively cheap. And the depth of water is 75 feet, so that it's not a electric issue or anything like that. Crop prices do pay into it on the amount of water, but still, there is no fallow ground. And if I don't have a certificate right now in Buckeye, what else can I do but farm? I mean, we cannot just pave the whole area with industrial. Okay, there's just not that demand. And so 1.3%, decline rate is just way over exaggerating if we stay with the status quo. That's saying we're going to be completely out of farming in 70 years or so. It's not going to happen if you can't build another house there. So that's my point. And so it's important to get the status quo decline as good as you can because everything else is compared to it. And if you're saying, well, if we do nothing, it's going to just go down like there, so everything else is not any better, that it just we're shooting ourselves in the foot. The water use is there. It will continue to be there. And so we need to flatten out that status quo, especially in the Phoenix AMA.
I appreciate the comments. Something I didn't mention is these rates are the averages across the AMAs. We definitely understand that different areas within those AMAs are very different. And as things develop, as water conditions change, different areas may be more likely to continue farming, other areas may be more likely to stop for different reasons or develop. So that kind of spatial piece of this, that geographic piece of this, is something we're wanting to refine a little bit more in this analysis. Jake, I'll let you go, and then we have someone who's online who has their hand raised. Okay.
Thank you. I appreciate all the comments here. It covered almost everything I wanted to say, which is awesome, and some. So thank you. I think ag attrition rate's an important component of this and how we analyze it. I think the work we've done shows the long-term, before DCP, ag attrition rate in Phoenix is higher than Pinal, probably due to Phoenix's explosive growth over ag lands over the last, 40 years. But when you look at DCP, I think that's where we end up with that 3.7 is the intense cuts that the Pinal Pinal had more ag, Pinal had more cap ag pool water, and thus Pinal pulled back farther, even on groundwater, because of the way the districts were designed. I think the districts have done a lot to redesign and meet the farmers' needs. So I think if there's a way we can try to look forward, I think it would be important if we can look at that data a little closer. And then sorry, you were gonna.
I was just gonna say, you said some analysis that you've done. If you're willing to share that, we would be more than happy to look at that, talk through any information you might have.
Yeah, that'd be great. So that piece around ag attrition, and we've also looked, we kind of have a really neat example in and around Maricopa in MSIDD. Maricopa didn't exist in its current form 25 years ago. And there's data from ag pumping from all those years. So you get a really good, pretty clean snapshot of what ag to urban has historically looked like. How those lands have transitioned, the current groundwater use, the historic groundwater use, the fact that we make effluent. So, we're still refining it, but if we can, Natalie would love to come and just share our little snapshot of how it worked. And thank you.
Nick, I think we had someone online.
Nicole Sonnenberg, you can go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question. Thank you for raising your hand.
Of course. So I think a lot of people have already kind of touched on this subject in regards to agricultural attrition. So I'm repeating a little bit here, but I really feel like the ag urban concept was born out of finding a solution for the moratorium. And so I think it would be a really beneficial exercise for comparing how much of the agricultural attrition that was occurring in the past, we'll say 10 years or more, was associated with a certificate being issued for that land. And what is the percentage of that agricultural attrition that's occurring because a certificate was able to be issued? And I think that's just beneficial information for us to have and be aware of when we're having these discussions.
Thanks, Nicole. And Scott, I think.
Thank you very much. Just to help not confuse things because of the differentials between various AMAs, I'll just deal with the Pinal AMA. It applies to the Phoenix AMA also, but it's easier to see in the Pinal AMA. Whenever you decide to use a straight line attrition, you reach a vanishing point. It goes to zero. And that's impossible. You made the comment that we don't know this factor or that factor, it could do this or it could do that. But one thing that we do know is the Pinal AMA is not going to, I don't know what a 2% gets you down to, I'd say what, 55, 60 years, that there'll be no agriculture left whatsoever in the Pinal AMA. I think that's pretty impossible. So you've created a scenario that is statistically unrealistic. There definitely will be changes, and for various reasons. And one of the changes that is not being factored into this at all is the interface between agriculture in Arizona and state taxation law. In a farm in Arizona right now, there are very few things that are elastic. Most of your costs are inelastic. You really, you're a price taker. You can't do anything. But there's one thing that's totally elastic, and that's rent. Right now, rent still enjoys a fairly high dollar that it brings on a piece of farm ground. But when farmers are forced to go in and pay these high rents and also repair the water infrastructure, there comes a point in time where they give up. They have to, because it won't work anymore. But the elastic thing that can change is rent. An investor, and in Pinal AMA, almost all farms are rented. They're not owned by the people that farm them. That investor would give somebody, if he had to, he doesn't want to do this, but if he had to, he'd give a farm out to somebody rent-free if that person fixed the water infrastructure and farmed it, because his tax rates would be so much less. Now, we haven't got to that yet. But believe me, if ag stays to where it doesn't pay for long enough, then rents go down. And then the abilities to fix infrastructure automatically are included in that elastic cost differential. So it's not just the concept of whether or not we're going to hit a period of time to where we get some rises in the profitability of agriculture. And we certainly will. We don't know when, and we don't know how long. We don't know those things, but they're certainly there. But the concept of somebody lowering rent to make sure water flows on their investment property so they keep agricultural tax rates on that property, that's baked in the cake. That's a reality. Seen it happen before. We haven't seen much of it just lately because some insurance programs and some various aspects have allowed some things to happen further than what normal agricultural economics are. But believe you me, when things get to where people aren't fixing infrastructure, rents go down so the infrastructure can be fixed.
This is Mike Caparoso again. I need to get a relationship in my head between, has the department considered when they're doing this dashboard, I know you're looking at groundwater use specifically and the amount of groundwater that was used on that property. And I hate to flash back to the past, but an IGFR has been given an allocation of water based on their, well, some combination of water duty acres and irrigation acre. Pinal didn't fare real well with that relationship on a retirement standpoint because of their irrigation acres were a lot larger than what their actual water duty acres have been. But did the department ever consider an allotment based on the allocation of ag, similar to the extinguishment credits, maybe something more than 1.5 acre feet per acre, or maybe less. But have they ever considered just coming up with a standard conversion rate based on the allocation of the IGFR rate, instead of trying to anticipate 3 out of 5 years of groundwater use, the replenishment obligations, the effluent use, CAP water use? It really complicates the formula quite a bit. But if you go back to some percentage of the allocation, it seems to take a lot of that ambiguity out of the dashboard. Now, it's just a thought. I just wanted to see if there's what you're thinking on that.
I understand where you're coming from with the question, and it's not something we've talked about extensively. Part of the reason for that is this kind of necessary piece for this program of making sure that this program results in actual realized water savings. Most folks, or on average, I should say, maybe not most folks, but on average across the AMAs, folks aren't using those full groundwater allocations. And so if to try to base something off of that, it would, perhaps we could consider it, but my kind of gut instinct without looking at the data, so don't hold me to this, would be that it would have to be a fairly low percentage in order to ensure that the assignment of that type of conversion would not result in increased water use coming out of the aquifer. So it's something we could look into, but it's not really something that's been thoroughly contemplated so far.
And I'd hate to get into that famous term of personal property rights and all that fun stuff that DWR has dealt with over the last 50 years. But an irrigation grandfathered right is personal property right. And they're allocated water and they're allowed to use that water, groundwater, indefinitely. So maybe there is savings by some type of retirement of that acres to urban. And it's not that urban isn't using water, but it would likely be less water. But the allocation allows them to use that much water, groundwater. And that's in the future with scarcity of surface water rights, maybe more effluent going to other uses other than onto ag fields, the whole CAGRD thing. This is going to be an interesting process. That's all I can say. There's a lot of moving parts. And I'm just looking at possible ways of maybe simplifying those moving parts with the same end result of groundwater savings in the long term. And I know the Assured Water Supply Rules tried to do that. I was part of that process in the 90s. I'm not totally convinced this doing what it was expected to do with ag conversion rights. We have a lot of work ahead. That's all I can see. I don't know if anyone's concurrence with that, but that's what I'm seeing.
Definitely would concur with a lot of work ahead.
Dave Roberts, Natalie, you and I have talked about this attrition rate last week for a while. I agree with a lot of the concern about this, as you know, and one of the things I think the department ought to think about is having, much like you do with replenishment, with variable replenishment rates, perhaps we need to have variable attrition rates as well to take into account just with and without this program, what it's going to look like. Again, we can go down to specific areas, West Valley versus East Valley, and see what happens. But I think the department ought to think about that as well. So.
I wish to applaud Mr. Caparaso. I do believe that you poke the elephant in the room. I believe it's something that absolutely needs to be discussed because there's many factors in it that we're not bringing into it. But one of the concepts that I haven't heard it said by the department, and I don't know why there isn't some recognition of it. You speak to irrigation grandfathered rights who that are not using their water. So if you were to convert those, all of a sudden you'd have more water use because that right wasn't using its water. Well, let's look at the other side of that. Development has gone on for some decades, and we have rights like that sitting out there. And there hasn't been significant incentive for them to convert. And the entire time that they've been sitting out there, they've been building an absolute mountain range of flex credits. So their annual water use is meaningless now. And when that situation happens, that's how you get into situations that cause a great deal of trouble. Because those rights, I will assure you, if you'll look at what's going on in the state right now and some of the things that we're in here having this discussion about, areas like Wilcox and areas like Harquahala, there are times when someone sees a profit motive in a water supply and goes and sticks a lot of money in getting it out and causes trouble in doing so. One of the things in the Pinal AMA the only reason we have a physical availability problem in the Pinal AMA is because we're counting all those rights that you're stating that we're going to, if we convert those, then we're going to use more water. But the only reason we have a physical availability problem is because we're counting all those rights. So there is a meshing here. If you take a big portion of those rights and extinguish them for a physical availability right, you have an enormous conservation that's just occurred. You've changed the entire equation, changed the ratios. And also, the recharge off those developed acres is much, much larger than it was off of the agricultural acres. You start factoring these things in, and I do believe that Mr. Caparazzo was very, very correct in saying how many things that we're going to talk about are going to affect the modeling, where we have a very, very simple way to really gain some enormous benefits for the aquifer through reduction in agricultural rights for conversions. So I hope that stays on the table, because I'm just thinking that as we go through, maybe some of these concepts have taken years to get refined, and so many meetings that it absolutely took one's breath away. But some of this might be easier than we think if we'll just look at it in fashions that might be easier to calculate.
The point is well taken for both Scott and Mike on if there are ways that we can simplify, perhaps we consider that. Like I said with Mike, it's not something we've really looked into at this point, but perhaps additional discussions can be had there. One small point of correction perhaps is that the assured water supply model analyzing physical availability includes current rates of agricultural use. It does not account for the full allotments. And this 2% here that we have in terms of attrition, in terms of agricultural decline, is also incorporated into that model. We used that same rate from the model.
One quick question, and maybe we can talk about this another time if this is way too in the weeds, but something you just said triggered this thought. We're looking at rates of groundwater use on acres that have not been retired within an irrigation district. If you, and this is something that will become a bigger problem, I think, if more water use occurs, markets change and whatnot, than if you're just looking at the last couple of years. But for the land that's in the irrigation districts, the IGFR allotment doesn't matter that much. What really matters to the farmer is what your irrigation district allotment is. So if you are in a district, you have a 3 acre-foot per acre allotment, that means all of the land in the district, as long as your groundwater right allotment's not lower than that, that's what you're going to get for all of your acres. And that turns into a lump sum of water. And so what you see is you'll have 0 reported use for some water right, but the farmer that has leased that land is using that water plus the other water somewhere else. And so you're going to get a 3,000 acre foot lump sum, and you'll use it anywhere. They don't really care. They just, when do I run out of water, basically? And then as we go through the reporting, we have flex credits, or if you don't need to use flex credits because I already have, I'm still under the allotment for that right. That's how it works. But I'm just asking if it may not change the math if you're looking at just the actual total reported water use, because you're still capturing the number in there. But if we're looking at, there are going to be a lot of 0 water use rights in the irrigation district specifically, that actually the water that's allotted to that land is being used. It's being used somewhere else in the district. So what I'm getting at is, if you do account for that, if you retired those 0 water, and I know that we're going to have some use requirement to do this program, but even if you retired 0 water use acres, you're going to reduce the allotment in the district, because every acre of land in an irrigation district gets an allotment, whether it's been irrigated in 25 years or not.
Excuse me, I think that is absolutely correct, except for the Pinal County district that I represent is called Holcomb. That's the only reclamation district in the United States jurisdiction that has no debt, no wells, no pumps, and no water. So there is nothing to be allocated. So as we go forward and start to study, you might just mark that district as kind of a unique situation that maybe we could come up with a unique solution.
It's just clarifying what I said after Dave just poked me here, if it wasn't clear, but what I was getting at is if, because every acre in these districts gets an allotment if it has an IGFR, if it doesn't have an IGFR anymore, it doesn't get an allotment. So the total amount of water that the district can deliver to, or that farmers can use goes down. So you're going to use less ag water, even if you're retiring land that they weren't actually farming.
And in the concept of calculating how much agricultural land will come out over time in the districts when they are based on that, every time acreage comes out, the remaining acres get an increased allotment. The same amount of water they're putting in, the districts are putting in more ability to withdraw groundwater. So every time you retire an IGFR, you make the resultant IGFRs more resistant to going out.
Am I, forgive me if I'm getting this wrong, am I hearing a disconnect? Because I think I heard Dan say that the amount of water the irrigation district is going to be distributing is dependent on how many IGFRs are in it. You take one out, the water use goes down. It sounds like you're saying, Scott. Okay.
When an irrigation district that depends on well water,
Mhm.
they make their allocation of the supplies they can deliver divided by the acres they have to serve. If you reduce the number of acres they have to serve, the allocation to the remaining acres increases. So you make the other farms stronger. So the concept of having a straight line diminishment of agricultural lands in the Pinal AMA in particular is really, it's actually, there's so many factors that enhance the remainders as things come out. So it's impossible to have a straight line diminishment. It won't work that way at all.
And just clarified what Scott's talking about. I think that that's largely true for the big CAP irrigation districts when there was a lot of CAP water available. But for Central Arizona, Maricopa, Stanfield, they have actual annual limits on how much groundwater they're allowed to use, and it is tied to the IGFR acres. So now that they have not functioned this way until now, essentially. But because they have their agreements and bankruptcy stipulations with the United States, so they can only pump so much groundwater, and that does get chipped away as we lose irrigation acres. So that historically has been true, but going forward, if we're only reliant on groundwater, the districts can't divide groundwater among fewer acres essentially forever.
But to your point, Scott, ag doesn't disappear. Understood. All right, we're furiously taking notes. Is there anyone else who wanted to comment on agricultural water use or ag attrition? I know there's been a lot here. It's going to take a while for us to pull apart everything that we noted here. Anything else? Great.
To the next slide, which I believe is our final assumption slide, finally. Thank you, everybody, for the comments and the patience. So last items that are assumptions that go into the dashboard, and I've lost track of who it was. Someone mentioned type ones. In any case, so for industrial growth, our assumption here was based on type 1 conversions. So in an AMA, an IGFR can retire to a non-irrigation grandfathered right called a type 1. That type 1 can have up to 3 acre-feet per acre of non-irrigation use. So what we did is we looked at the ag attrition rates. We looked at the total number of acres that had retired pursuant to type 1s. And we looked at the actual use of those type 1s over time. So using that, we created a factor that could kind of be peanut buttered across all of the ag attrition acres to have a small portion of industrial use included there. That's reflected on the dashboard, what that actual amount is, but sorry, I'm losing my numbers here. Here we are. In Phoenix, the use on type 1 acres is 1.26 acre feet per acre. In Pinal, it's 0.98 acre feet per acre. And when we kind of peanut butter that across all the acres under kind of taking into account the proportion of type 1 acres versus other acres that we would expect to retire, the acre foot per attrition acre values we used for the purpose of the dashboard was 0.17 acre feet per acre in Phoenix and 0.31 acre feet per acre in Pinal. So the reason those sound low is because not all of those acres are going to have industrial use on them. Some of those industrial use values are going to be solar, like we've talked about, things that are very low water use. Some of those acres are going to use more than that value, but it should kind of come out net about the same. This industrial water use assumption is something that we are definitely interested in additional data about. If anyone knows about an additional data source that we should be looking at or places that we can be evaluating how to refine this particular category, our expectation is that utilizing the type 1s in this way is probably an underestimate of industrial use. But we've really struggled to find, again, we talked at the beginning, wanting this to be data driven. We've really struggled to find specific data to industrial uses on retired agricultural land or industrial uses over time and how much water they use. So that is definitely a data source that we are interested in if anyone has access to anything like that. Rob, go ahead.
I don't have access to data, so.
You're my source of data. Yeah, this is a difficult topic to really get your arms around. I would say that to the extent you could do a deeper dive on more recent industrialization activity, that you're probably going to get a better picture of what's going to happen going forward in the future. Type 1 rights, and I've been practicing since 1987. And I think I did my first type 1 retirement in 1987. They are being much more heavily utilized today than they were back then. And the simple reason is the availability of water generally. A lot of industrial use was taking place within designated water providers that had water supplies that they would give to the industrial user. And now we're seeing outside of designated providers, we're seeing quite a bit of industrial use coming in. It is the one use that can move forward under a moratorium on housing. And so I think if one could try to find areas where industrialization's been happening in the last 10 years as opposed to the last 30 years, you're going to see probably, number one, much higher utilization of individual type 1 rights. And number two, much higher conversion of irrigation rights to type 1. So I think this is one that would be helpful to get a better handle on. And I think we're missing one of the big trends here. The one other thing I wanted to say is I'm not sure incidental recharge for industrial water would be 0. A common use of type 1 rights is for landscape watering, non-irrigation landscape watering, and I would think there'd be some industrial or some incidental recharge there. it's not going to be 25%, and it's particularly because of conservation requirements. It's going to be more, if there is one, it's going to be more in the range of municipal, maybe a little more than municipal, but not missed completely. Having said that, quite a few of these industrial uses like bottle manufacturers or data centers, those are going to have zero incidental recharge. So it would be accurate for that. That's all I have.
Well, thanks for teeing up the other piece of this slide. No, you're all right. So we have, for incidental recharge, we have 4% of total use for municipal incidental recharge. That number is pulled from the assured water supply rules, where designated providers in Phoenix, Pinal, and Tucson have a 4% incidental recharge rate added to their groundwater allowances each year. That's based on their total use. So we've just adopted, for the purpose of this analysis, we just use that same rate that's in the assured water supply rules. For agriculture, we are using a 25% incidental recharge rate. This is a factor that we have done some sensitivity analysis on, but kind of chose a middle range number for the purposes of the dashboard. There's certainly additional discussion that could be had around that rate. Industrial water use, to Rob's point, we currently have this as 0 in the dashboard. There are certainly uses of water in our industrial category, parks, golf courses being kind of the traditional example of that do have incidental recharge associated with them. Part of the reason that we chose 0 for incidental recharge for the purposes of the dashboard is kind of exactly Rob's point, is the types of things that we're seeing on some of these acres that would be expected to be retired agriculture are more frequently things like solar or the bottling plants or data centers or things like that that typically don't have incidental recharge associated with them. So we elected to use 0 for that value. Now, we can be open to additional feedback on that particular value.
That number's not going to shift
It won't be substantial.
It won't be significant.
Yeah. All right. That was a ton of information, and we've already had a lot of really good discussion. I can pull up the dashboard if that's helpful. We've got about 25 minutes left. We were supposed to end at noon, right?
Yes, and they've told me that we need to get everybody out at noon because there's apparently another meeting, but yeah, we have another 24 minutes.
So I can pull up the dashboard if that would be helpful, or if folks want to continue discussing if there are any additional questions or comments as we've been going, we can certainly continue that. Go ahead, please.
This should be easy. Does ADWR track, well, they obviously track the annual reporting for golf courses. Now, is there a way of distinguishing which golf courses are 100% effluent and which one are groundwater versus maybe some kind of CAP supply? Just to get an idea what the scale that we're looking at here, because the push for effluent on golf courses has been huge. So there may be very little groundwater savings or impact.
Yes. So the short answer is yes, we do have those numbers available. If you had asked me 3 or 4 years ago, I could probably quote them off the top of my head. My recollection is that somewhere around half of golf courses use some amount of effluent. But I would have to double check those numbers to be more certain on that. But that is something that ADWR has in annual reports data.
Yeah, just see what kind of impact golf courses are having on the aquifer. I think that would be good information.
I would like to see the dashboard.
And well, Can I ask a question on the dashboard? Can we see is there a way to get it? Maybe it's on there somewhere. I try to look for it, the actual formulaic that makes the dashboard run or is that something I know it sounds like you're still working on it.
That's proprietary. You can't get that.
The black box. Yeah.
As
I can
as
try to
stated,
reverse it.
See,
but-
everything we do is public record. So.
We did not call it a black box.
So we do have kind of the raw data set posted on our website for the underlying data that goes into the dashboard and creates all of those charts. Not everybody loves data in a tabular format, but it exists. So,
But I was saying the formulas that you use to then drive the dashboard. So you take that raw data and then you have to have some.
So let me first say that this first page of the dashboard, I know most of you have seen this, and I know this is impossible to read right here, but I just always want to point this out. I have a lot of the assumptions listed out right here at the bottom of this homepage on the dashboard, and that is a good source of information as a starting point. In terms of the actual graphs that are produced on the dashboard, what those are is sums based on the categories that they show. I hate to use a pivot table as an example because nobody uses pivot tables except for me. But if you imagine just like a summary table, it's exactly just the sums from that tabular sheet. Yeah. Yeah, there's no like, in terms of the data set used for the dashboard, there's no fancy math or anything in there. We tried to make it really straightforward for that background data set. Yeah.
So,
Oh, sorry. I don't know which one of you were first.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Terry Sue. I think.
So what I'm kind of curious about is on this particular one, it shows the ag lands converting from, I don't remember how many acres that is, or water use it is, but it goes from the full water use down to, practically nothing by, I'm going to say like 2035 timeframe.
Yeah, it's a 100-year projection, so 21, 25.
Well, I'm talking about, not on the current, but on the WITH program.
Yes.
Yeah.
So the reason for that is because we are assuming that 100% of
Goes on the ag
is
land.
occurring on ag land, it's the assumption built in there is that that development will drive additional retirement of agriculture faster than that kind of status quo rate would have been.
If you assumed a similar attrition rate on desert and on ag, did you guys test that and see what that would be like if you actually let it go down by the attrition rate that you've assumed, as opposed to letting all the growth happen on those acres?
So we've looked at that. I don't have it built into the dashboard. I will do my best to have that added to the dashboard by the time this group meets again.
Thank you.
That's something I've wanted to add to the dashboard and just haven't had a chance to yet. In that vein, if folks have additional suggestions or tools that would be useful on the dashboard, we do want to consider this a working product. And like Ben mentioned at the beginning, we've already added an additional button for a new replenishment rate on there. If folks have specific items that they would really like to see on the dashboard, we're happy to attempt to make those updates.
So kind of with this picture and then also going back to the recharge and how, we talked about you have industrial at 0 and should it be 1 or 2, and that just doesn't move the needle at all compared to 25% for agriculture. Again, I've already made my case why the line should be much flatter, but right there, and you've done sensitivity, like what if that was 15% or so? I mean, that flattens the line even more, or what that does is it shows ag using more water, which makes any case for ag to urban look better. And so that's a big sensitivity there on the 25%. So do you happen to have a graph on your sensitivity when you did look at that?
We don't have that here. I think maybe since that's come up a couple times here, that is something we could evaluate adding to the dashboard as well. I'll have to see how difficult that is. But I'll see whether I'm able to make that available for the next week. Yes.
I think you said this, but what was the 25% ag based on? Was that historic or?
So that is actually the value that is used in the Phoenix Active Management Area model.
From my recollection, which increasingly is becoming less reliable, Pinal AMA is always just 20% for incidental ag recharge. I've never seen the number down there at 25%.
I was thinking it was higher. I will double check and confirm that, Scott.
My recollection is it's been 32%, so maybe you can check on both of those numbers.
Well, I'll confirm those numbers and make sure we share that out. Okay. Anyone else?
Can you remind me what the allocation in this model was for acre foot per acre use for ag and Maricopa and Pinal AMA and Phoenix AMA? I kind of remember it was like around 3 for Pinal and maybe a little less than that for Phoenix. I just don't remember that, what I read.
Yes, so that is on this page. I know you can't read that. I will read it out for you. So agricultural groundwater use in Phoenix was calculated to be 3.8 acre feet per acre over that 5-year historic period we were looking at. And in the Pinal AMA, it was calculated to be 3.0 acre feet per acre.
Okay, and that's just groundwater use. It's not
Groundwater,
total
yes.
water use per acre.
Yes, but so groundwater use is what we're looking at in terms
right.
of producing conservation, but the incidental recharge rate did take into account total water use.
Okay, thank you.
Looks like we might have a couple of questions online. Nick, if you want to call on those.
Nicole Sonnenberg, you can go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
I'm willing to go, but I think Peter Mock had his hand raised first, so if he wants to speak first, he can go ahead.
Peter, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Just to follow up on the previous question of how did you do the dashboard? It sounds like you said pivot tables. So I'm just looking at the URL. It says app.powerbig.gov.us. So is it on a cloud server? You're running Excel, or exactly how did you enter the formulas?
So the program that we used to create this dashboard is called Power BI. It's a program that can take tabular data and produce visuals with it. So all that it's really doing on the back end of that dashboard is summing the different line items in the tabular data according to different categories.
And can you add any other formulas to it except summation?
It has the ability to do that. I didn't use any other for this particular dashboard.
Okay, thank you.
Nicole, you can go ahead and ask your question.
Thank you. I don't have a question, but I did have a few comments. One, Paul Gardner is not here, but he's been a pretty big advocate about including effluent in the dashboard or any of these assumptions. Now, I don't think it should be accounted for in like replenishment or anything, but I think it would be, once again, another good exercise to look at the effluent generated from these conversions. It can be a line or something included in the dashboard, but I think that's another beneficial thing to consider in these discussions. The other thing that I wanted to add regarding the replenishment rate that I want everybody to be thinking about and considering is that when we're talking about the replenishment rate, it's not just numbers or data. We are also, that replenishment rate has a financial cost. A minimum reporting replenishment obligation means that for that replenishment to occur, someone has to pay a bill. And that replenishment is very expensive, around $800 per acre foot. So yes, it's putting water back into the aquifer, but there is a financial cost associated with it. And I want everybody to be keeping that in mind when we're having these types of discussions. Thank you.
So if we took and just came up, went into the air about 100,000 feet and looked at what we're trying to accomplish, it seems to me that what this program is really about is about providing for some groundwater in the mix in a water supply portfolio, whether it's at a certificate level or at a designation level, because we all kind of understand that the cost per acre foot of a renewable supply, non-groundwater supply, is exorbitantly expensive, and it's getting more expensive by the day. And so would it be, and I think I hear what you're saying, which is overall, this program at the end of the day needs to show that we've used less groundwater than we would otherwise have used, right? That's the goal. Well, are there other ways that we could approach that problem? Knowing that agriculture is going to do what agriculture is going to do. When they can make money, they can make money. When they can't, they're going to wait until another time when they can sell their land and it become urbanized. Those things are going to all naturally happen. But is there another way we could approach this and say, for example, that we're looking to provide X percent of the new development can use a chunk of groundwater, but not the whole thing, let's say 10% or something like that. Is there another way to address this issue? Because it seems like what we're tugging on here is, how do we know that ag would not just naturally convert? So we're trying to guess about something that hasn't happened yet. And we have really no way of figuring out a formula that will satisfy us and make us, and that we can say, now we have this formula that we believe that this will happen, something that hasn't happened yet. We're trying to set up a system to predict something that hasn't happened yet, and we want to be sure that we've guessed right. I'm way up in the air now.
I appreciate the kind of zooming out as we're getting close to our time here. From a water management standpoint, it is really critical that this program can be reasonably expected to use less water, both in the long term when we're thinking about the 100-year totals reflected in this chart over here, and on an annual basis reflected kind of in the time series at the bottom. Are there other ways to do that? Almost certainly. And in terms of thinking about what are the components that we build into this? Is it, okay, are we thinking about this conversion rate in terms of 100% groundwater, or should there be a portion of other supplies that should be contemplated here? I don't know that I can answer that today. I think it's a fair question to ask, and perhaps that's something that we can continue discussing and considering as a part of the broader process and the additional meetings that we'll be having coming up.
Excuse me. Yeah, I think that's right, Natalie. We'll have to mull on that one. And I think at the same time too, this isn't the first time the ideas come up, right? We all saw it last session, and then I expect we'll see another version popping up in the legislature this session. So it appears to me that this is certainly a lot of people are thinking in this vein, but we can mull on other ways to think about it.
Did you? We are running low on time,
Yep.
so I am going to take us back to show.
And there's not much left to show on this one, really. What I'm doing, this is for anybody. You're all in the technical working group, right? But for anybody who's watching online or anybody who's in the room who hasn't added themselves to the email list, you haven't lost a whole lot, but we did send out some information last week, and we'll be providing updates to folks who are formally in the technical working group. This is a link to join that group. In the past, you had to have a Gmail account to be able to sign up. That's not a prerequisite to government engagement, so we got rid of that. You
Just get rid of it lately, because I tried to get on it.
Well, I personally apologize to you, Scott. I think it's before that, but maybe it wasn't. Either way, that button has been unclicked, and I went into a private browser with no associate Gmail, and I was able to sign up. So you're welcome. It was for you that we did that. And
It was actually for me.
it was actually for Rob. And then next, if you'll hit the next one, I just want to remind everybody that we've got another meeting coming up. This is the broader stakeholder group. It is not going to happen. It's okay. It shouldn't say that. The line is in the wrong place. Good grief. It's going to be on the 5th. Who did that? That was me. Okay, so here's what we're going to do. We're going to ignore what's on the screen, okay? It was going to be on Thursday, and the reason we changed that is because number one, our friends at CAP have stuff going on that day, and number two, our friends at the legislature have stuff going on that day. So from now, thank you, Natalie. From now on, we are going to be trying to keep these on Wednesdays to avoid conflicts with the legislature and with CAP. So the next meeting will be on Wednesday next week. We look forward to having continued the 5th. What did I say? On the 5th of next week on Thursday. And we look forward to continuing these conversations. Really appreciate you all coming. Really appreciate the frank but friendly discussions. And you all have access to our contact information. We'll keep this going. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.